Renegade, man when afraid, man in the wilderness. Yeah, man, wagwan. Evening. Remember tonight at the Titans, So I for deal with a guy when he Ponis, right? Them did have a Michael Manley commemorative lecture in a UK few days ago. I'm gonna watch that here because the man is a great statesman, Great statesman, visionary, real visionary. Yes. So I'm gonna look on the life and think about Michael Manley with Michael Manley. I'm gonna start with some other things with Michael Manley. With a guy that about 70s mash up what Michael Manley do. Him shouldn't have called Michael Manley name in my mouth. That are the one Andrew Jones. Very out order. Very out order and ups. And when you hear him come and talk one thing, I say him come back like anybody that get up and vote for. Vote for criminal. Nobody in Jamaica in the world ever come and say Michael Manley. Say Jamaica lose 1 cent and your name come up. So we're gonna put your name on something because 1 cent. Not even 1 red cent. Not 1 red cent. See? Yes. And nobody couldn't tell us, say, they might investigate him for illicit enrichment. Visionary. Poor people defender. But change aspect of the country. Yes? Him to water. So I could have start this and watch this because we're mash him up. We continue to mash him up because the man, him sick in the head. Yes, him sick in the head. Death spot. Very sick in the head. And some people will start go to prison for the idiot thing. I could start my show.
We in lump sum, we a beat it till they am a burn. We not make them get in on them and again. None of them boy that we none of them. We in lump sum, we a beat it till they am a burn. We not make them get in on them and again. None of them boy that we none of them. We alone some rise up the bomber dude.
I'm not a Judas, them a backstabber. I'm my wife, and this straight beauty and glamour. No guy can walk to near me with no dagger. Maybe the heart of Mandela, but they might have a zama in the mold like a bull man. We send us the jammer. Lyrically inclined, be a metaphor, so no listen to lyrics line to line. Become a lyrical fighter. Put up in everything, they want some more hole in a hater. Lyrically inclined.
Yes, man. All right. So maybe just start play this right away, and then we come back to it right away. Yes, man.
I'm the Dean of the School of Public Policy here at the LSE. And let me tell you that this is a very special event and a very special evening. I've been at the school for a number of years. I've chaired lots of events, but I think this one actually does deserve the label special. We're here to commemorate the work and the life and the legacy of a great leader. We were just saying in the green room that it somehow seems that a generation ago, the world had these leaders who were larger than life. My personal view is that many leaders nowadays seem sort of smaller than life. Michael Manley is certainly one of them. Like Mr. Manley, I come from the Americas. I'm originally a citizen of Chile. I also come from a family of social democrats. Personally, for me, it's a great honor, among other things, because I grew up thinking of Michael Manley as somebody whose work was to be emulated. And on a very personal note, I was telling the family, and I will introduce them in a second, that my father had as a prized possession in his study a picture of himself with Michael Manley, and at one of these Socialist International gatherings. So on behalf of the LSE and personally, it is a great opportunity to be here. We're also very lucky to be joined by some wonderful guests. A number of members of the Manley family are here, and we will be joined by two of them on the stage in a minute, and they will share with us a few thoughts and a few remarks. And on stage already, we have Professor Anthony Bowes from Brown University and Professor Chico Ferreira from the LSE, who will also be providing some thoughts. In the case of Tony, a longer set of remarks and thoughts on Michael Manley's life. Before I introduce everybody, let me just get some housekeeping details out of the way. If you're in the room, please remember to put your phones on silent. The event is being recorded. We will ideally turn it into a podcast. So silence is quite important. We will have some time for questions toward the end. If you happen to be here, there'll be a chance for you to raise your hand. If you happen to be following the event online, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will have a chance for people online also to put a question or two to our speakers. It is also particularly suitable that we should be holding this event at the LSE because Michael Manley, former Prime Minister of Jamaica, was a graduate of the LSE. He studied here with the great Harold Lasky, the great professor of politics and government. I am good friends with the person who has that chair today, and I've thought, you know, there are few chairs at the LSE more impressive than being the Harold Lasky professor. Chico Ferreira here is the Amartya Sen professor, which is in the running for the coolest chair at the LSE. But, you know, Harold Lasky professor is, you know, when I grow up, I want to be the Harold Lasky professor. And Michael Manley, of course, was one of Lasky's distinguished students. So that's part of his great legacy and great tradition. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers in a minute, but before that, we would like to hear from the Manley family. So we're lucky to have both of his children. I mean, not all his children, but Natasha, first of all. Not all of them, exactly. So we're going to have some remarks from two of his children who have very kindly and generously joined us here tonight. So let me begin by inviting Natasha to join us on stage. Oh, actually, both of you guys can come together. Yes, why not? David, why don't you go grab a chair over there? After Natasha.
We can just do it together.
We can sense it. Absolutely. Great.
Thank you so much. It's amazing to be here, the legendary LSE. It's with enormous family pride and a great sense of joy that we acknowledge this event on the 100th anniversary of our father, Michael's life. A retrospective discussion of his political, social, and philosophical influence on the world stage. And not just of his presence in the times of his activism and political administrations, but also by the mark he left through his writings on Jamaica, the Caribbean, and the world. It can also be said his ideas are still being felt and relevant in these troubling times today. There is so much more to be done. Perhaps a reconsideration of the fundamentals, the things he most dearly cared about, tackling inequality through fairness in politics and economics, can help us all to reimagine his idyll, a more just world for everyone, everywhere. On behalf of myself and my brother David and our siblings who are all watching online, all over the world, and all the Manley family, we would like to thank the organizers, Daniela Hickling, Paul Burke, Ricardo Chin, and Verrill Tomlinson, We're so appreciative of the time that you spent creating this event and putting this together, and also huge appreciation to sponsors Jamaica National Bank and The Voice. And of course, the London School of Economics, his alma mater. It really is an honor to be here at the LSE, a place our father spoke of with such reverence all through our childhoods and when we were growing up. We all grew up listening to him talk about his time here, how much it shaped the rigor and expansiveness of his thinking. He was greatly inspired, as we spoke about, by influential lecturers such as Harold Lasky, who he called a brilliant and life-changing teacher. Fellow students who then went on to become lifelong friends, Errol Barrow, later became the Prime Minister of Barbados, and Arthur Brown, who went on to a highly distinguished career in public service in Jamaica. London during the 40s was a hub of Caribbean nationalism. Active in the West Indian Student Union, our father was very much a part of that transformative energy. It was a time he would bring to life for us, his family, almost daily, through fascinating anecdotes and stories about people intent on changing the world, figures that became mythical to us and inspirational to us as well.
And finally, we would like to thank tonight's presenters, the chair, Andres Velasco, and speakers, Francisco Ferreira, and of course, our great family friend, Tony Bogues. Our father thought of Tony as a son, really, and we're greatly touched by his loyalty to our father's memory and all the work he's done over the years. And handing to them, we will echo our father's favorite greeting, which we heard many times growing up. The word is always love. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David, Natasha, for those moving words and those very accurate words. And as you point out, his legacy is political, but it is also scholarly, and we live in history, and that is exactly what we're here going to commemorate tonight. Before we turn to our speakers, we're going to invite one more person to join us on stage very briefly. His name is Leon Hamilton from the Jamaica National Bank. He was involved and important in making this evening happen. And thank you for joining us on stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Velasco, our chair, our panelists, Professors Bogues and Ferreira. I greet the Manley family present here. Ladies, gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for having us, the Jamaica National Group, at this discussion into one of the great sons and leaders of Jamaica, whose impact and ideologies have extended beyond the shores of Jamaica. In Jamaica, Manley implemented groundbreaking policies on land reform, the nationalization of key industries, and investments in education and healthcare. And these initiatives transformed Jamaica and set a precedent for other developing nations. His ideas on social democracy and economic reform inspired similar movements within other developing nations, and his legacy, as Natasha said, offers valuable lessons for today's leaders. The Jamaica National Group is pleased to support this event. Throughout our 150-year heritage as a leading financial services group in Jamaica, with operations and a presence here in the UK, through our representative office, through our Voice newspaper brand, we have supported initiatives that enhance and grow our own community and contribute to the success and growth, right, of our members, using business as a force for good in different forms, including supporting programs such as this evening's to honor a great son of Jamaica and of the world. We thank you for having us, and like all of you, we look forward to the discussions on the great man. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon. Again, David and Natasha, thank you very much. Let me now introduce our two speakers. Tony Bogues is a writer, a scholar, a curator, an author and editor of 11 books and over 100 articles in the fields of African and African diasporic political thought and theory, intellectual history, and art from the Caribbean. He's the Assemaster Professor of Humanities and African Studies in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And he's traveled all the way from the United States. So Tony, we're doubly thankful to you for being here. Francisco Ferreira, as I mentioned already, is the Amartya Sen Professor at the London School of Economics, and he runs the Institute on International Inequalities. Chico, also very, very thankful to you for being here. Professor Ferreira has had many, many publications on social development and inequality across the world, but particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. So his presence here is very much apropos. So without further ado from me, I'd like to invite Tony. Tony, you said you'd rather speak from up here. Floor is yours, and the microphone is also yours. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to begin by thanking all of you for being here tonight. It is a really auspicious occasion for many reasons. I would also like to thank the LSE for hosting this, but also the School of Public Policy, but also thank the organizers from Jamaica, New York, and the United Kingdom, all PNP folks that were mentioned by Natasha. My brief remarks will be focused on some aspects of Michael Manley's political thought. And then secondly, I will also locate him as a Caribbean political personality, a political intellectual, and an activist who straddled the world stage. And that he straddled the world stage at a specific moment in world history, the moment of decolonization. Since we are at LSE, the university that Michael attended and graduated from with a degree in government, after deciding that he was no longer going to be an art critic, but a political journalist, it would be important to mention the individual lecturer and teacher who was most important in his intellectual training. We have heard that name. It is Harold Lasky. It is interesting, I think, to think about that a security report from the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States Security Services generally, in 1975 wrote a report about Michael Manley that says that he is a follower of Harold Lasky. Michael Manley himself thought that Harold Lasky was a brilliant professor. And in a book edited by Glenn Manley, Truth Be Told, he makes the point that he was not just a brilliant teacher and intellectual, but that he, and I quote him, put together Marxism, Mr. Michael said, with British liberal tradition. As a colonial student here in the 1940s, searching for a political philosophy, Lasky then was a catalytic in the thought of Michael Manley. But I would suggest to you that being catalytic does not make anybody a follower, and that there are other sources of importance that shape the thought of Michael Manley. One of these was his upbringing, living in the house of Edna and Norman Manley, with Edna Manley being the leading artist at the time in Jamaica, and Norman Manley being the political father of Jamaican independence. And in that household, which must have been a remarkable household growing up with his brother Douglas, the discussions at the table must have shaped him greatly. And the discussions on the table that he has spoken to me and others about were really about not just Jamaican independence, but also about notions of equality. So I would want to suggest that the other influence was not Lasky, or other than Lasky, was what happened in that household. That the second other important influence had to do when he returned to Jamaica in 1951 and became a trade unionist. And that as a trade unionist, in the fields of trade unionism, he learned to quest about equality, but he also attached equality to something called democracy. So one just has to read his book, The Voice at the Workplace, to understand how he began to twin those two things, equality and democracy. And then the other element I think that shaped him was the cauldron of West Indian nationalism that was here in London, where Michael and others worked, Elsa Gavaya, Arthur Brown, and others, Errol Barrow, Forbes Burnham, all were active in what was considered to be the West Indian Students' Union. And the West Indian Students' Union in the 1940s was this cauldron of anti-colonialism for the Caribbean, and very much also an idea about federation in the Caribbean. All of these elements I would want to suggest combine to create what Michael Manley himself often identified himself as. And I repeat that, not what I say he is, but which he often identified himself as. And here I quote him, "I'm a member of the Democratic left." Two questions immediately arise. What are these elements of the Democratic left? And how did the context of his life, British colonialism, and the moment of historic decolonization shape these elements? So let's start first with context. At the beginning of the 20th century, and Manley is a seminal 20th century figure, one common adage was that the sun never set on the British Empire. Those of us in the Anglophone Caribbean had felt the lash of racial slavery and what the late Barbadian novelist George Lamin had once called the various violences of British colonialism on both, and I'm quoting him here, both on our mind and bodies. This is one context in which Michael Manley grew up. But 14 years after his birth in 1938, there was an important set of worker struggles throughout the entire Caribbean, which inaugurated a new period of Jamaican and Caribbean anti-colonialism. And it is also in that period that the People's National Party, an anti-colonial movement, was formed. So that Michael Manley did not just grow up under British colonial rule, he grew up where the resistance to that kind of colonial rule was beginning to be very intense. So another element of Michael Manley's political thought was a certain kind of anti-colonialism. In other words, that he grew up and developed a notion of anti-colonialism. And in that notion of anti-colonialism, he began to deal with or understand and grapple with this question of sovereignty. And sovereignty would become absolutely critical for Michael Manley and his work. You cannot understand his demands for the new international order, along with his partner at that time, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, that the NIEO was really about a certain kind of equality, and that was not now should be in a nation, but equality between nations. I've always thought that it was interesting that Michael went to LSE, Julius went to Nyerere, Julius Nyerere went to Edinburgh, and I've always thought what it is what happens to the colonial intellectual when he or she comes to the metropole to study and he or she begins to question the actual metropolitan system of colonialism itself. From this particular anti-colonialism, I would argue, sprang another element of Michael Manley's political thought. And this is equality, which many of us have written about. But it is a different kind of equality. It is an equality which is a foundational equality. It is an equality, I would argue, in which there is no negotiation about what it is a human being is and what are the conditions of life of a human being. On this, he was absolutely clear. He was taught that form of equality, not now just at the dinner table with his parents, but I would argue he was taught that equality in the sugar fields of Westmoreland, where he worked and where he spent time with workers in houses that looked like hovels, built in the 19th century, where some people, men and women, were still living. That experience of working in places like Westmoreland as a trade unionist meant therefore that his understanding of equality was really a capacious one and really, quite frankly, a foundational one, and one which he never veered from. It also meant that in a country like Jamaica and the Caribbean, where questions of race were important, given the legacies of slavery, and given also the history of colonialism, that for Michael Manley, equality was twinned with something called dignity. And this idea, therefore, of dignity for countries in which was the Black majority who had lived under the lash of slavery and colonialism was what I would argue was central to his democratic left political philosophy. So we can summarize this as equality, dignity, anti-colonialism, and sovereignty. And all of this leads to a set of practices of social justice. But importantly, in the context of the world moment of decolonization, such kind of ideas and political practices would shake the world. We know that in the post-World War II period, the decolonization moment opens up with India, in the independence of India in 1947, and then of Ghana in 1954. But there are two forms of decolonization that happened in the world in the post-World War II period. The first kind of decolonization is what I've called anti-colonial sovereignty. That is where the nation state changes its flag, where a new native elite takes over, but that there is no transformation of the colonial society. The second kind of decolonization is what I have called a radical form of decolonization, in which there's an attempt to transform this former colonial society. Michael Manley's politics and his political thought belong to this second category, a category in which, therefore, for him, what was most important was the transformation of the Jamaican society. It was a transformation in which the elite of Jamaica and the world were to be dispersed. That is, that their power was to be dispersed. But more importantly, it was a kind of politics where the ordinary person, the everyday person, and that his or her status would change from what in Jamaica we call the sufferer in the 1960s and 1970s, and that status would be transformed. Time does not permit me to list the various elements of that transformation process in the 1970s, which Michael Manley led. But I want to note two things about that process of transformation. The first is a word coined by Rex Neckelfeld, who was his friend and who was my supervisor, my thesis supervisor when I was doing my PhD. And the word is called semanticization. Right? That is, how does a Black person of that Jamaican become somebody? So the semanticization of the ordinary Jamaican person. The second is what is important, because all of this was happening in a Jamaica in which was caught in the vortex of the cockpit of the struggles of Cold War politics. Because Cold War politics was the other geopolitical feature of the Second World War, not just decolonization. In this particular context, I would argue that it is Michael Manley's efforts, Michael Manley's political thought and practice, which made it clear that we in Jamaica were not just struggling for Jamaica and the Caribbean, but that we are also struggling in a global stage. It is why he argued, along with Nyerere and others, for the NIU. It is why he argued for non-aligned. And it is why he argued that there was going to be no peace or justice in the world until the so-called third world countries at that time had economic freedom and economic justice. Quote him, "There is no viable future," he says, "for Jamaica, and indeed for mankind," he says, "unless we transform the world economic order." So this capacity to move from Jamaica to the world was not just because as some of his critics said, he liked to perform on the world stage. Rather, it was a deep understanding that colonialism was a global project of Europe, and that if you were going to overturn internally that project, then and its legacies, then you also had to act globally for forms of decolonization. What is the core objective of Manley's political thought? And I myself have been thinking about this for some time, a lot of the times in discussion with him and a lot of times out of discussion with him. And even in his passing, the discussions happen in my head with him and sometimes without him. And I think one can summarize that core of his political thought from a speech that he gave in 1975 in Nairobi, Kenya, to the World Council of Churches, in which he says, what we are about, he argues, is that we're about liberation. And liberation, he says, is the defense of people against propertied interests. Liberation, he argues, is about creating forms of popular democracy, political and economic. Liberation, he argued, can only be successful, and here I quote him, when people have access to the decision-making process in a community, regionally, nationally, and internationally. Wow. So that therefore for him, the question of liberation is tied again to something that we can call democracy. And so I would want to argue that equality in Michael Manley's thought and political practice, questions of justice in Michael Manley's political practice, actually fuse in a concept of liberation, and that the concept of liberation is essentially spelled out as forms of popular democracy. What does all of this have to do with our world today? There are many challenges that face us in the world today, but there are just four that I think I should mention. One is climate change. The other one is the deep inequalities in nations and between nations. The third is racism, and the fourth is war. And on the question of war, I think that we are, as a human species, in real danger, because the applications of technologies to war has increased not just the velocity of violence, but has actually reshaped the character of violence itself. But when you think, therefore, of the foundational equality and of democracy that Michael advocated, then you have to then understand that violence is also a product of inequality. To commit violence on people and to commit war, you create enemies. What political theorists Smith would talk about friend, enemy, but you create enemy. To get rid of somebody, he or she that you are getting rid of, you make that person not a human being, but you make that person something else. All genocides have that characteristic. All genocides, from the colonial genocides of the 15th century to the present forms of genocide, wherever they are, begin by renaming human beings as something else. That means that what you are doing is that you are not making these people who you are fighting against or going to commit genocide against as human beings. On the business of racism, it is linked to questions of inequality. The current streams of authoritarianism, whether in Europe or in the United States, are really foundational around questions of are people equal or people not equal. That's the heart of business of racism. On the business of climate change, the way in which profits are now constructed over people means that, therefore, again, we are thinking about forms of inequality. Michael Manley does not provide full answers. He himself would argue with all of us, including myself, that the answers that we need would need to come from the forms of popular democracy, forms of participation of ordinary people, so that they could help us and give us some of the answers. However, I think that what might be important is that we need to understand some of his ideas which emerged in this historic period of decolonization. And here I want to make one final point. That to grapple with the thought of Michael Manley and his political practices, because there is very little difference between practice and theory in the work of Michael Manley. He is a political intellectual, which means that he is thinking all the time. He's developing a certain kind of ways of thinking about politics while acting upon it. And sometimes he makes mistakes, but who of us doesn't? But he always feels that the nature of politics, and particularly of progressive politics, he says, was about you having a set of ideas in which you can struggle and which you can organize for. That the nature of politics is not about just simply resource allocation. This party gets in today, gives his friends and so on, that the next party gets in, gives his friends something else. That if you're talking about transformation, you have to talk about a set of political ideas and how those political ideas change the society. But I would want to suggest that to grapple with Michael's thought and practices means that you also have to think about Michael's relationship to the mass movement in Jamaica. The mass movement which opened in 1968 after the October 16 Walter Rodney's riots. That Michael Manley was embedded himself intellectually and politically as part of that mass movement. And what I would want to suggest to you that is tremendous oratorical skills, the skills of oratory, which everybody loves, and they sometimes call it charisma, a word which, by the way, he hated with a passion, right? That oratory and all that skill and so on, which he has, comes from a certain relationship which he had to that mass movement, which began in the 1968 after the Walter Rodneys, and that there's a riot, and that there was a complex relationship between him and that mass movement. So when you are thinking about Michael Manley and his political thought and practices, you also have to think about that mass movement in Jamaica and the Caribbean, post-1968. In doing all of this thinking and reflecting on Michael Manley and reflecting on the world today, I would just simply want to suggest that we pay attention to Michael Manley's thought and practices, not as the key to bring a better world, but as one of the resources that can make change and difference and create the kind of world that we want to all live in. Thanks very much.
Professor Ferreira, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Although my father did not have a picture of himself with Michael Manley, as Andres did, I did grow up in the broad democratic Latin American left at a time when it was impossible to do so without feeling Michael Manley's influence, and that of others like Frantz Fanon, who were also mentioned.
So for me, it's an honor to be here with members of his family and other friends. Now, when I was asked to participate in this panel and saw that Professor Bogues was going to be speaking first, it became very clear to me that my comparative advantage was not going to be talking about Michael Manley himself. And so instead, what I would like to do is to provide a little illustration of this intellectual and political legacy that Michael Manley had, which has been referred to. And to do that, what I want to do is to share very briefly with you, there's Michael Manley, and to share very briefly with you some recent results from a big initiative of work on inequality that we've done here at the LSE, but together with people at Yale University, at the Inter-American Development Bank, at the IFS in London, and at many other places. And this was this Latin American and Caribbean Inequality Review, of which Andres was also a part. And to do that, I will take you through just a few slides summarizing what I think of here as two systems of reproduction of inequality in Latin America and the Caribbean. We've heard already today about how equality and fairness were central to Michael Manley's thought. And although we use data that is much more recent and much more plentiful today than Prime Minister Manley would have had when he wrote The Politics of Change, which I just put a picture of here, which is a very important book where he developed ideas about equality and equality of opportunity in that context. Although the data that we have is much more recent and plentiful, as I say, I think you recognize many of his ideas and influences in the topics that we're covering. So what are these two systems of inequality reproduction in Latin America that the review thought about? Well, let me start with three very basic facts about inequality in Latin America, which many of you will be known to you. Here are series of Gini coefficients, measures of inequality for different regions in the world. And there is Latin America at the very top. So inequality in Latin America is definitely very high as compared, for example, to the industrial countries over here, but really to anywhere else. Now, not only are they high, but they are multifaceted and interconnected. And in this graph, what I show you are rates of stunting rates for different quintiles of the population in a number of Latin American countries. So, for example, this here is the stunting rate, the rate of malnutrition in reference to OECD. This is the Latin American average. And each of these dark points is a poor group in Latin America. So this is the poorest group, say in Bolivia, and this is the richest group. No. This is the poorest group. This is the richest group, right? So the poorest groups have the highest rates of malnutrition. There's two things you can see there. First, there is inequality also in malnutrition, considerable inequality, but also it's related to income. It's correlated with income. There is an interconnection in these inequalities, in health and education and income, which is something that I think Malcolm Manley understood very well. The third fact is that there's clearly a racial component to inequality in Latin America. And here we have average household incomes by race and skin color in different countries. And you can see the cloud of black and brown at the bottom and white and pink at the top. So it's an inequality that is not anonymous. It clearly has a racial component to it. So what are the two systems of inequality reproduction? And I'm going to show you very, very quickly some evidence of what we call in this review the short cycle and the long cycle. The short cycle is on the scale of the human life. It's a life cycle, okay? And it begins in the family. These graphs here, and I'm not going to have time to go into detail, but what these graphs show is the gap in vocabulary and cognition for children in the second, third, and fourth quartiles of the population relative to the poorest. So before they get to school, when they're still 0 to 5, in countries like Colombia or Peru, there are very big gaps in the vocabulary and cognition before kids even get to school, depending on the family that they grow up in. When they get to school, that gets magnified. So here what we have is the rates of completion of tertiary education, the rates of completion of university, okay, relative to if your parents didn't have even secondary education completed. So in my country, Brazil, I don't know if you can see the number here, the number is 15. Of people whose parents had no secondary education completed, only 15% themselves would complete the university. Oops. If one parent had secondary education complete, you add 30 percentage points, 45%. If one parent had at least university, you add 70 percentage points, so 85%. Okay, so you see the importance of family background and the injustice of that intergenerational transmission of inequality in that way, right? Now, you take these very unequally skilled workers and you bring them to a labor market where there are unequally productive firms, and you get a multiplication of that inequality. Focusing on this graph over here, the inequality of firms manifests itself in many different ways, but one of them is the size distribution of firms. So this is Latin America, the first bar, and the other bars are kind of richer countries. Okay, this is working self-employed, working in small firms, working in big firms. What you see is that in the richer countries, a lot more people work in big firms. In Latin America and the Caribbean, and you can think of our informal workers in the streets of Jamaica or Rio or Sao Paulo selling whatever they're selling in the streets or making food in small parts. We all work in smaller firms. Why does this matter? Because the smaller firm workers are in the bottom of the distribution, whereas those who work in the much bigger, richer firms are in the top of the distribution. And that's compounded. That leads to a big return to education premium, but that's compounded by Latin America's failure to redistribute in the state. So I've talked about families, I've talked about schools, I've talked about the labor market. You might correct that with the state, with redistribution, as indeed, as prime minister twice in Jamaica between 72 and 80, and then between 89 and 92, Michael Manley tried to do. But the Latin American average is much lower than the levels of redistribution obtained in Spain. And you can see there a variation across different countries, but on the whole, our states also fail to redistribute. That's the sort of life cycle, the short cycle of redistribution, but it is embedded into a much deeper, longer historical cycle, which I think, as we heard from Professor Bogues, Michael Manley also thought about a great deal in the context of the colonial heritage. And that are the historical roots of inequality in the region. And again, I can't do justice to this topic here in 3 minutes, but this is just some plots showing the percentage showing across areas in Latin America, across space in Latin America, not countries, but regions. The percentage of enslaved population back in the 18th century and inequality today, without controls, with controls. But you see that correlation, you see some evidence, this is not causal evidence, but some correlational evidence of the inheritances of slavery over such a long period. The more I study inequality in Latin America, the more I think slavery was the capital sin, the original sin of inequality in a lot of our region. This led to persistent wealth inequality. Of course, if you have all the wealth concentrated in a few white landowners, and then a vast majority of population brought from abroad, I'm talking about Jamaica, Brazil, Haiti. Obviously, it's different in the Andean countries where it was the indigenous people. But, there's a similar story going on there of disappropriation. And here is the share of income, of wealth in the top 1%. Is roughly 40%. We don't have that data very good data for many countries, but for the 3 countries you can see here, 40%. And that is the share of the bottom 50%. So 1%, 50%, roughly around 0 or between 0 and 10, right? And wealth is, of course, linked to power and the long-term persistence of power. And this is really pretty much my last slide, but I just want to show you a little bit. This gentleman here was born in 1523 in Spain, and his name is Juan Vázquez de Coronado y Anaya. He was a Spanish conquistador. You know, Jamaica dealt with the British as colonial metropole. Many of us dealt with Portugal or Spain long before. And so this was a Spanish conquistador of what is now Costa Rica. A historian tracked the number of presidents and members of parliament in Costa Rica historically that were family members, basically descendants of this man, and 31, no fewer than 31 presidents and 285 members of parliament descended directly from Don Juan Vázquez. I can assure you, many fewer for most of the indigenous people who were there at the time. So there is then the cycle of economic inequality, inequality of power, and inequality of opportunity, which is a topic that Michael Manley addressed in that very first book. So let me end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chico. I think that was a masterful way of bringing Prime Minister Manley's thought and concerns and the things that he gave priority to the present. Many of the problems that he thought about 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago have not gone away. Some are slightly better, some are slightly worse, but his concerns very much remain our concerns. We have some time for Q&A, not a lot of time, but I hope the organizers will not mind if we run over 5 or 10 minutes so that we have some time for dialogue. And let me open the floor to anyone in the room first and then online who might want to participate. Say something, ask a question of our 2 distinguished speakers. When you do, please identify yourself. If you could say your name and whether you're attached to the LSE or some other institution. Yes, sir. There's a microphone coming your way, I think, right here.
We can take a couple of questions.
Can we take a couple? Sure, why not? That way we use time more efficiently. Please, go ahead. There may be a little switch on the side there. If there isn't, there's another microphone coming your way.
Okay.
There we go.
I wonder, just in terms of looking at the Caribbean today and at particular countries in terms of progress, are there any, or is there one in particular that you would look at and think, well, they're modeling the work of Michael Manley and his political ideology. And it's out there, perhaps more so than others.
Very good question. We have some sad stories, but ideally we also have some success stories that Tony would like to point to. The list may be short, but there must be some.
Let me respond quickly to both questions. The first question on independence is that his vision of independence, as I understand it from discussions and so on, was rooted in a certain capacity of the Caribbean. It wasn't just Jamaica, a certain capacity of the Caribbean to redefine itself in the world. And in that redefinition, it was about a certain kind of sovereignty that we would have. And that sovereignty was not just political sovereignty, but it also meant economic sovereignty, and it meant a certain kind of cultural sovereignty, a cultural set of ideas about us in the Caribbean that would define us as Black folks and other folks who have come to the Caribbean, but in a way in which there was a Caribbeanness. There is one of the fundamental things about Michael Manley is his commitment to a Caribbeanness. This is no accident that the best book on West Indies cricket is his, The History of West Indies Cricket, because it is actually cricket at that moment in the 1970s and so on was actually the game that brought the entire region together after the collapse of the Federation in 621. Okay, so that's how I would define it, really very simply. Whether or not what that means for today is much more complex because the global economy is much more interconnected than it was in the 1970s and early 80s when Michael was around. It is also an economy in which, in my view, is more unequal in many ways. It is also an economy in which the elites are not just now white elites from Europe or from United States, but so the elites are from some of the former colonized countries. So that it is a much more complex terrain in which you have to, which one has to navigate. But I would also think that that independence, if you want to talk about independence, then you have to talk about questions of cultural sovereignty. But you also have to, begin to redefine what that sovereignty means for you, not just in Jamaica, but also, quite frankly, within the region. And I'm not just talking about the Anglophone region. I'm talking about the Hispanic, the Dutch, the French region, and so on. That we are a region, and that is something that we need to pay attention to. So that's my quick answer to that. On the question of success stories, I'm afraid not. Mm-hmm. There is no good news. One has to see that the defeat that when the People's National Party lost the election in 1980, it was politically, ideologically, and militarily defeated. Right? Those three things. It was just an election in which people were voted out. And Michael, when PNP was voted out, it was a certain kind of defeat, in my view, organized by certain forces around the world because of what the role that Michael and the PNP was playing. The second collapse in the Caribbean, in the Anglophone Caribbean at that time, then was in 1983, October, the implosion of the Grenadian Revolution. So I think those two things, the defeat in 1980, as well as the implosion of the Grenadian Revolution in October, created a new political game. And in that new political game, the question of change, the question of transformation was not even on the back burner. It wasn't at all anywhere. Because what we all did was that we imbibed the language and the practices of neoliberalism, or what operated on something called the Washington Consensus. And that therefore transformed our countries, in my view, into something else. And what we now have to begin to work through is 40 years of neoliberalism. And inequality that you talk about is rooted in slavery. Absolutely. I studied slavery. Absolutely. But it is reproduced and reorganized and readapted in Latin America and the Caribbean through neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is the heart, a certain kind of economic development in which what happened is that those is about winners and losers. And that the winners are always the elite and the losers are always the ordinary persons. And therefore, what you have, in my view, in the Caribbean is a situation where everybody is afraid of what happened in the 70s. Because what happened in the 70s, say in Jamaica, was traumatic for many people. To be militarily and politically and ideologically defeated is not an easy thing. It traumatized. Between January and October, 800 people died on an island of a little over 2 million people. What therefore that meant is that people felt, well, I give it a phrase they use in Jamaica, I saw the thing set. And if I saw the thing set, then I just saw the thing set. Right? And if I just saw the thing set, then what you have to do is that you have to, you then have, you just have to go along and navigate the best you can. But I saw the thing set. And to begin to change that idea that there is a possibility of change is one of the things that those of us, in my view, who are progressive and want to see a different Caribbean have to begin to think about.
Well, I'm have to stop him there so little. You notice me just play him out and make on ear. When hear for yourself. When it's come and talking bag of bulls to that about no earthers, you have a charge with treason. The party where you're in now. Yeah, but carve out a thing for yourself. You're gone with the clique. Sell we out. And think everybody dunce and stupid like you. Can you line up yourself, you know? And you're stupid because you're against the people and I tell them, say you're with them. You're not with them. Manley with the people. Mark with the people. Patterson was with the people. Mama P was with the people. Not you. Not Siaga. Not Buster. No. Can't trick nobody, boy. Yeah? You understand? When you see what I want, so you just go on and know. And know your dollar the value. And you know, I'm not saying, I tell you, look at what I tell people. You soon feel it. 3 years' time. You're going to feel, everyone around going to feel. Look at him, I take people feel that. Anybody stand up and talk against man, them for charge of treason. Them are idiot. Can you imagine you have a prime minister now where the shame of the world, the nastiest thing. Yes? Where film statutory declaration can't, listen, it can't even go through nothing at all. Like right now, see my court case, them have him for illicit enrichment. Not even 1 cent. In a mandate time, not even 1 cent. Him up here, it's where I come from. Andrew now come from there, so. And him come down here, so. With the poor and needy. And this guy, Andrew, Russian. Titans are deal with you, you know. Up to today. You see what we're under the 70s? You for charge of treason. Just even mention that out of your mouth. You charge of treason. 1 man, 1 little island. 140 mile long by 50 around 56 mile wide. When you look the superpower world, superpower, and for what? To open people's eyes, but the whole world look on. Real statesman, you never reach and place there now. And you're on the NHT and a chat bag of bulls. And I play your party thing for charge of treason. It's a nastiness. I don't know who that talk against Churchill. I'm a matter of fact. Them have a war in Ukraine now. Where me Javinsky, where me the guy for Ukraine. Who that talk against him when Russia rush him? And then war is a more like a superpower to him. And he must stand up against them. Where do you as one of the guys them from over Ukraine did a fight against your president? Eh? You have a charge of treason. Man, then a little bit of thing him got through in him, open up the thing. Me I tell you this and I'm not joking. This is about them this and that when you know. You know, so the powers were being and trying to do everything. And by the way, you still the one that are going. And I'm still hold the backside and farm the thing like OPEC and we still go school and we still not hungry and we still have JRS and I'm still putting everything we put in a place. Till them find a way, want to assassinate the man and them find a way, yeah, military and otherwise and kill so much of our people. That's a goddamn disgrace. I want to talk against him. That's why I'm born in a say, because I want to know good enough. I want to know good. No, them not good. That's for born them. Be a fire. Yeah, man, them not good. Them can't tell me nothing. Real man, they are. It's to the core. Because you have to have an identity. You can't just get up and your people, them are live. So just to cover people, them are live right now. You have people that live out, you know. I want to say anthem out. Them place where we live, you can hear people talk, you know, see people knock you down and say, beg your spoon of salt. Or, me buy a squeeze of toothpaste. And that's what we do right now. Back in the days, whenever they did so. You buy a squeeze of toothpaste. Now, the 80s, we go there. But we could have eat food. We'd have free education, go straight up to university level. A man there show you won't not come with it will not work. So when you have one superpower, I'm just kind of just when him go back in, just easy and relax. Kind of say, you know, one superpower, you know, you remember say the world they tear down and one superpower and them thing there. You see me, I say, it bad man. It bad. It bad. When you have great leaders, visionary in your country, no care what, you know, only not get up and put him down. Say, I'm going to kill 153-year-old people to grab power. Yeah? Everything depend on the island and fight against one little man. And same time, they do that, you know, the little man make sure the people in Jamaica are right and set up so much thing. You know, the hostile environment. And I say, no, and we not bow, we not creep on none of me. You know, so my spirits, they not creep on me, you know. Though, if you ever tell me that, I'm going to move you up. Because I'm not bow, you know. Nah, bow. Mankind have dead one day, so me rather listen. Me not bow. Yeah? Me not bow. Don't tell me no foolishness. See me, I say, don't tell me no foolishness. Andrew Owen is the worst thing in history. Boy, you're not prime minister. Yeah? Your statutory declaration cannot certify them having done for enrichment, for illicit enrichment, and not even film thing, you know, can't work it. Never have a business. You have shell company, no workers or nothing. You can't say this about man that you talk about the 70s. The man had the world to fight the man. And them a fight for third world cause for everybody look up to the man and salute him. Let me finish this. Titan, I'll crush you later, you know. Let me finish this. Yeah? Finish this, man. Yeah, man.
Sorry, I don't have good news.
Thank you, Tony. Chico, you've studied Latin America and the Caribbean. Any success stories that you'd like to highlight? Or will you take a pass on that one?
No, I'm feeling daring today. I shouldn't, you know, disagree with Anthony on the Caribbean is an extremely risky thing for me to do since I know the Caribbean much less well. However, you know, we did have Prime Minister Mia Mottley here last year, who we were pleased to host, and been to Barbados a few times. Barbados may not be the utopia that Michael Manley wanted. You know, if you're a political theorist, often you're right in terms of what the ideal is that you want to reach. Nonetheless, it has one of the lowest levels of income inequality, the way we measure them in the Caribbean. It has a sort of independent voice in Mia Mottley and others, including on the issues of climate change and small islands. Far from perfect, but maybe a little light at the end of the tunnel, maybe. I don't know.
I would agree that Mia is the exception. All right. But she's
He asked
surrounded.
for one.
Yeah.
I'm giving him one.
Yeah, but she's surrounded by a sea of normality.
And for all we know, she may be the next Secretary General of the United Nations. So that will be a very visible example of one. I have no private information about this. I just repeat what I read in the newspapers, but it is not completely impossible. Maybe we'll take one or two more questions. Yes, the lady right there, and then the gentleman over here, and then I'm afraid we
I think there's some people from line.
Oh, yes, and let's take one person online so that people online don't feel that being discriminated on. Yes, madam, over there.
The two countries' relations, and it seemed a very independent worldview about how to build a connection with the like socialist countries during that time, especially the location of your country is next to the US and among others. So for my opinion is like, would you mention like from this more than 60 year or 70 years relations, what's the current issue about the bilateral relations and your country? I mean the still value this relationship, or it's like a closer than before? That's my current issue. Since I'm not that familiar about this issue. Thank you.
We'll take a few. Shall we do that, and then return to you? The gentleman over here, please, in the front. There we go. And then we'll take you back there, and then somebody online, and then we will call it a day.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello, good evening. I'm Lyndon Mikasa, LSE alumni and write and research for the Voice newspaper. I have two questions for each of them. For Mr. Bogues, I just want to know if you see any Caribbean countries that have the potential to reflect some of Michael Manley's positions and policies. And for Mr. Ferreira, with many of the graphs that you showed on inequality, particularly the one on how the impact of slavery on populations, I'm just wondering if you have any data on some of the other smaller island states such as Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, St. Lucia, etc. I just wanted to know if you have more data on that as well to show the impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a tough one, but I'm sure Shiko will have the answer. The gentleman in the back there, yes.
Can I do the online since I have the mic?
Sure, why not? Please.
Okay. So question by Lethan Ken. What role did Manley play in the global fight against apartheid in South Africa and the wider anti-colonial and Pan-African movements? They're from St. Lucia.
Thank you very much. Great question.
Hello, so my name is Malik. My connection to this event is threefold. So I graduated with a degree.
A little bit louder, maybe we can't really hear you here.
No worries. My connection to this event is threefold. So firstly, I graduated here with a degree in law a couple of years ago. I was born in Jamaica and I'm a member of PNP UK. So my question is more of a call to action, or how I can do it, or how people can do it. So in line with Michael Manley's philosophies, how exactly or what non-partisan steps can the youth of Jamaica in the UK take to disseminate his ideas in Jamaica?
Okay.
Tony.
Let me. The relationship with China. The relationship with China is still, I think it remains the same, and it is vigorous. I think that when we visited China in '91, it was to cement the relationship, not at the level of ideology, but really at the level of economics. And the economy, and I remember spending a lot of time with economic personalities and figures in China. trying to think through what are the economic projects that the Chinese government could do that would enhance not just the relationship, but that would enhance quote unquote development processes in Jamaica. I think that the Chinese have since that time, since 1991, Chinese government has set up has established its own kind of matrices and hold its own set of policies about how to treat the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. Certainly in 91, when we were there, there was no, that was not fully formed. There was a discussion, but it's not fully formed. I think that is now fully formed, and I think you're looking at things like infrastructural development, both in Africa and the Caribbean, as part of the Chinese, as part of the Chinese relationship, right? So that's my quick answer to that one. So I think that relationship is still there, goes across governments, quite frankly. On the business of the Caribbean, I think I accept Mia Motley as a light within a dim, otherwise dim corridor. Let's put it that way. And there are people. The new Prime Minister of Grenada, I think, is thinking about how to do certain things. This is not like Michael Manley, and he wouldn't want that. I would think it is more confronting what are the problems you have and how do you then confront those problems and what methods do you use and so on. So, but I think like the jury might be, it's too early to say what Prime Minister Mitchell, what precise path he's going to follow, for over the years. But in conversation, one conversation with him, as well as watching, some of the things, some of the policies he's doing, you can see that as a young person, he's in his 40s, trying to think through what it is that Grenada needs to do. So I think that I would just add that as not a full light, but a kind of, it's beginning, people, someone beginning to think about, because he just got into office. The other thing to think about is, the other question is apartheid. This is how I will answer that, very personally. When 1994 happened, the elections were to happen in South Africa. Mr. Manley had cancer. And he was invited to head the Commonwealth election experts to come to South Africa. I went with him. I was at the university at the time, but the university was kind enough to give me leave. So we went to South Africa for 3-4 weeks. What was interesting to me, this is a man who has cancer, so he's sick, not supposed to be traveling. But he made it clear that the South African struggle, this Mandela and so on, was not going to come into office. And that he had done so much, and others have done so much to make that happen, that he wanted to be there at that moment. In South Africa, one of the things that we were responsible for was to go and look at election watch, so make sure everything is so-called free and fair. And one of the things that struck me was that everywhere we went, from KwaZulu-Natal in the north to places in Joburg, everywhere we went, people recognized him. And I was struck, right? Because, I knew he was popular, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I didn't realize that the depth of the popularity and understanding and the way the admiration for him amounts ordinary people. I thought there's that, and then political leaders, yes. But to walk up into a place outside of Soweto, where the lines are forever, and we just kind of checking on, what's going on, to make sure everything all right. And to then see people come up to him and just say, it's a Manley, it's a Manley. And you just say to yourself, what is going on here? Right? And so that, therefore, I answer that question concretely, to say that his contribution to the end of apartheid was not just Lancaster House, was not just, it was which ended Rhodesia, rather, Lancaster House ended Rhodesia, but also and created Zimbabwe. And wasn't just the kind of boycotts and so on that he did, but that it was recognized amongst ordinary people. In the same way, I would argue, that Bob Marley's appearing in Zimbabwe on that stage was recognized. The other thing I would say about that is this, which I think is really important, that in South Africa, politics operates very strangely sometimes. In South Africa, we met a whole host of people. And one of the persons we met was the former foreign minister under the apartheid regime, Pink Botha. And we had a 12 o'clock meeting with him at a place called the Carlton Hotel, 12 midnight meeting. That's what politics does, 12 midnight meeting with him at the hotel in Joburg. And we asked him, why did P.W. Botha, why did he move to not embrace, but to accept that the apartheid must end? And his response was, Mr. Manley, South African economy cannot grow unless we have links and factories and economic arrangements with the rest of Africa. Under apartheid, we cannot do that. So what was clear to us, we discussed, what was clear to us is that all the things, everything that we did, all the struggles, all the solidarities, everything, and so on that we did against apartheid, that it was the economic question for the Nationalist Party that forced them to the actual negotiating table. But his contribution, I would want to argue, can be seen in the relationship he had with Mandela, but also I would argue in the relationship of ordinary people to him and the face recognition of him by people in South Africa. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Chico?
The amount of information we have on the small islands is more or less proportional to the amount of time we have left. There is some measures of inequality that we have found in this review. On the relationship with slavery, I'm not aware of anything. There might be, but I'm not aware of anything quantitative.
Thank you very much. We are nearly 20 minutes past our time, but I think you will all agree with me that it's been more than worthwhile. I began by saying this would be a special evening, and I think it has been a very, very special evening. It would have been 100 years this year in December, I believe.
December 10th.
December 10th, that Michael Manley would have turned 100 years old. And it is no exaggeration to say that he was one of the great leaders, not only of the Caribbean, I'd say of the democratic left, as you said, and of the world at large. And the issues that he highlighted back then remain very much central concerns today. And of course, it is very fitting that we should be having this evening at the LSE, the place where he came, where he studied, and where he developed some of the ideas that he would later put into his books and also into practice as a Prime Minister of Jamaica. So again, Mr. Hamilton, thank you for being here. The family of Michael Manley, David and Natasha, thank you very, very much. We have been truly honored by the opportunity to host the Manley family here at the LSE. Tony Bowes, who knew the great man very well, as you've been able to tell from his remarks. Thank you very, very much for crossing the Atlantic and joining us here tonight. My friend Chico Ferreira, thank you again, Chico, for being here. And I think we simply have to thank everybody with a big round of applause.
Me a look for a place somewhere in Africa. I would send it to me. When you walk, them I show you the famous faces them in Africa. And when you look Manley portrait, Manley, Michael Manley, one big cell, you see this, that. I don't think I saw that. One of them African country. Yeah. This is how him do. It's not a man, it's a giant of a man. Not just a man where Andrew owness with him criminal self come enough up with and call him name. When you have a country, small country like that, yeah, but recognized around the world leader, statesman. And you have some little punk like Andrew owness try to push. I talk about the 70s and this try. That means him attack for them, you know, who help this try, or try this try, and they never this try. Them come, you know, with them foolishness. This try a lot about people them do in the 1980s and try a lot of more, you know, other things to discredit Jamaica. And we know it used to go in the 70s. But you still don't go to school. You still, back in the 70s when them one Andrew on this attack, 2 cents per bus. How much on bus now? How much on bus? Remember, in a Manley time, the biggest denomination was $20. How much now? They can't tell you. And you talk about the 70s and people, you know, come and you figure away, man. We never hungry. Yeah? That's why I'm telling you, say, you know, education is the key, man. I'm telling you, man. See? Yeah, man. Him for move, man. Him for move. That you run and you attack a statesman and, you know, like where dark father come out. He is the best. What? Una if you have respect, una figure. Una destroy the country front of. Remember we there, you know. I'm going to tell you again all this. It's like my little brother. And my little brother will follow me older than you two. And your wife. And my little brother and sister will follow me older than them too, you know. Yes. Them they both them that older than them too. Yes. See? Yeah, so and them they are doing one bag of foolishness. Garbage. With 21%. Them for charge of a treason. Anyone I know about Manley this and Manley that. When I international level and all you gotta do, I wanna take them nothing, you know, take out Sierra and put money with Manley. That's for banning. That's a total disrespect. And then the one like Nigel Clark come talk about you know, rival. Like you show it in our face and we know what going on. You can have some people sell out for people them. Eh? This worse than slavery, man. You see me I say? Yeah, man. Now I'm going to show enough more. Let me show now again. Some of Michael Manley, because you know, some of them think they when let me show you some of them. Hold on. See? Remember, you know, we have Titans later in our worries, you know, because we don't know we own this and go with him back of foolishness, but we're not joining it with him but steady and you talk about criminal and them man them couldn't call a man a criminal or nothing, you know. They might try and move them out of them way with for them kind of little things that we know the thing run. We know it run. But when you have they own them round there, I try help for destroy a man and then tell lie and try destroy a country and the people them just find out say a bag of foolishness. We don't know, no. We never go away. We don't know, no. We can't know, you know. Kind of messed up and then we not go like, we don't know them. We don't know them. Can't know them neither. None at all. See? We could look on some of the things them with Michael Manley. See that? Some of the awards. I mean, and them awards, you notice, and not Jamaica this, you know. You want to see them? Now I push them up and want to see them. Even now, if you beg now, bogus doctor like you know, because them man real stuff, them man really do what them are doing, you know. Them man are pilot too, you know. The man a fighter pilot too, you know. Yeah. You know, Canada, a matter of fact, me show you it. Because I don't know all these things. Man a pilot too, man. Man, they was a pilot. Air Force pilot. Yes. And I was a doctor of laws, Morehouse College, Atlanta, 1973. Order of Liberator, Venezuela, 1973. Order of Mexican Eagle. Go look for Mexican Eagle. What's the order of Mexican Eagle? Let me just see this. Mexican Eagle. Yeah? You have to look for them thing here, man. Let me just what's the order? Yeah. Mexican. Oh, okay. Let's see that. What's I'm going to show you some of that. I want to read it now. Oh, it was one of 3 Mexican imperial order. Oh, okay. The other Mexican established extraordinary merit. Extraordinary merit. I'm going to say I can't show it. You know, when you see them thing, you like look it up in the because you mandate for first in study. Come out of them thing. See that? It established a award for extraordinary merit and service to a state and ruler for outstanding civil and military service and outstanding achievement in the field of science and art. And of Mexican Eagle. Yeah. You never, no care where you're not prime minister. You guy and Jones is too enough. Yes? Have respect, man. Order of Osemati, Cuba. United Nations gold medal. You now see them thing in 1978. See there? For a significant contribution in cooperation with the United Nations and solidarity with South Africa liberation movement in international campaign against apartheid. Against apartheid, they do much people. One man in a little place and see it wrong. Lock down Mandela, lock down this, and we see the apartheid get lifted. Eh? Not just to Jamaica, not a selfish man. And then you have enough more. Meanwhile, we go through everything and we go same way. No care them attack and make it sound bad. You live through the day, you know, say, we have park. Oh, I could have tell you, say, we have parks and market and we road clean and them things. So all the thing I go on is like thing I go on. And when you say, I go get wicked now, you hear the people them start dead, you know, 3 more the 80 election. 76 more, him not get it. So them ramp it up in a 80. Yeah? Yes. Juliet Corey Peace Award of the World Peace Council, 79, World Peace Council, for contribution to the struggle of Jamaican people and all people of the non-aligned world fighting for economic independence. Upon them award, you will never get them award. Award, another Subi alone. And when big country have war with you, remember big when you have a superpower war with Jamaica, it look bad. And other join in a superpower war with Jamaica viewer. You just want our people them get recognized. And then them send them a little piece and tail siaga. Yes. And then who join them? The whole of them where you see them. Bush rat the whole of them. Charles him have to get locked up. 2 gun court and them thing. Appointment to the Queen to the Queen's Privy Council. 89. And a redactor of letters. Claremont University, California, 89. Confer the Order of Merit of Jamaica, 92 before him confer the Order of Merit for distinguished service in the field of international affairs. And now watch that. See it? Him run through the whole of that and never have an order from Jamaica. All when him get orders all over the world. You know? But you get crab a order. Crab. when I do nothing. When me just see for criminality and all kind of things, right? For them name not be a criminality, this guy Andrew. Remember you know the talk, you know. Carlton Alexander Memorial Award, 92 for contribution and service in public, in politics. Michael Norman Manley died, that and that and that. Okay. So me I run through all of these things. And you see these things? And one thing, one the card, and you see him not watch no face from Jamaica. One. Yes, one. Put it over there, sir. Now for showing these things. You can compare you're the round the man, the round NHT like a fear. You're coming like a crab house. And you have nothing about you. Yes, Andrew won't assume you attack. And your minions them. You understand? Yes, man. Them set up for one get with them before, you know. Yeah. See? Yes. So this is what them come with. Yes. And then you want to compare yourself with the look enough self. You should have charged for treason. You don't play politics with this man. You don't do it. You don't do it. When the world see the man, when that, remember, you know, him recognize across the globe, you know, not you. You go to India, go turn you have to force you go to people place, nobody don't welcome you. And you tweet when I know where I spend my money, you put everything in the office like I feel with 21% you toast. Hey, if you go, you know, if you go, man, he's a pest, man, to society. No, man, but so Titans are yet a crack, you know, you know the thing already, you know. So have Titans, you know. So have Titans. See? So have the Titans. You understand? So have the Titans. So, I want to know that already. Titans, you know, so have that, man. So have that. See? But him not have the manners. And then he matter about 19. Him listen. A prime minister, who you call a prime minister, you see? And when you look, you know those shadow where we see the IC report. And we see him have millions, look, hundreds of millions of dollars that run all over. We see money laundering, Mrs. Smith. Why would I listen to a guy like that? Him stupid, you know, and I point out thing about you studians, nothing like people are idiot. What you think? That's why I say I'm going to make sure done that thing there for education, you know. Up there, say, you know, university level. That's why I move it, you know, because the wife is stupid. Both style I tell you about food more than education back in 1954 too, you know. Yes. See? So I feel them think that. But man, they tell you, yeah, but your man they talk to any kid about 15 years. I don't look a boy. No prime minister not do that. No. You're not prime ministership. You're youngster man. You're criminal. You're figure man. You're the worst thing we ever seen in the world. The worst. And nobody never vote for 21%, you know. In a total, you know. One bag of baggage, you know. One bag of baggage. And then who him have with him, I run up and down and I chat shit. I something where jump dog and some sperm whale and all kind of things when a good neither. Be a garbage them talk to, you know. Not educational. Food, them food bad, you know. Some look for you look upon them, you look for you see how them stink bad. Yes. Them run out and chat about a bullshit. Yeah. You see me I say? Yeah, man. Yeah, man. The way I run out, and you can't run out and disrespect people where you look the whole world. And you see what I'm doing, you know. And you see him effect. What can I effect you have? You cannot talk about you have leader when I tell you these people. Look here, after nearly, remember, you know. Remember him did for more, 2 term, you know. 72, 80, man, they gone. From when they're 16 or 24 and they tuned on. So that's 9 years. So I'm even do more in terms, right? And then this is what I tell people, look here. Look here. Look what I tell you, say no, 3 years, look here. You know, I believe
tools. Total tools. They almost always have it.
Look how move this. 3 years. Yeah, them foolishness, sir. Everywhere I'm going to come with something different, you know. Hear this. The benefit, hear it. Wait, God. Hear the benefit of people. Hear the benefit, yeah. Me tell you, say, I have a question, man. Yeah. Who could have talked to you, son? Nobody not talk to you them way there, you know. Yeah. Hear this.
Fixing the economy, placing the economy on a sustainable path. Within the next 2 to 3 years, every Jamaican is going to feel the benefit of that in some way. You're feeling it now. Fixing the economy, placing the economy.
So the next 3 years. Remember the election for you for September. 3 years. Like he might fix the economy. Nearly 10 years, nearly 9 years this. Can you imagine man they fix the economy and put it on a stable part where him not do nothing. And I show you some bus. We have more buses around. Somebody talk to me today and they say you condition them to the bus when them just come down, they mash it up. I used to run for time and never even know I never take a bus. Never take none of them bus there. Then no. Me take JOS. From that done, me like me take bus, me drive. See? But lady I tell me say she park her car and take the bus because you used to have in air condition and then call the chichi. Take it from Portmore, come and she see something that she like, take it used to nice and clean. No one piece of thing. Me see bus. When take the bus them and never maintain them till me see driver drive with an umbrella with one hand. I was saying, I rain a fall I wet him up. So I'm afraid drive with one hand. How that work? You tell me. You tell me how that work. Tell me how it work. You ever hear man that say me a fix the economy, I prepare a stable part. Him come and him move, when I move in school and everything. Say him work. Him just pushing the thing and work. This is a garbage. This is a prime minister. This is a garbage. The people them the PR. Chat one bag of bullshit. Him. Line in pocket. When you look now, him I tell you, you're gonna feel it. Who ever tell anybody this? And you go with this. Yeah.
Fixing the economy, placing the economy on a sustainable.
What kind of sustainable you have fix the economy? When Porsche fix the economy, what am I say? Don't can't do this on IMF pass IMF test. You have to pass the growth test. Because the people them no that him say. And look what Porsche did that do. Now 4 years. He take 2 term, you know. He take 2 same like how them fix the hospital from 2017. I know that can't move it stock. Now at 2024. Then I think can't done. The road, when I'm saying fix and open, no matter when it open. When I'm telling you, it all have all kind of things under the road, you know. Fiber optic cable and one bag of thing under the road. You know, so be a garbage a guy talk, man. We can end electricity. We can end. They were never in it. We can end. But yesterday, I play a next thing with him. You hear me saying in 2015 or 16. We going to bring in and you're going to drink on your light. And you have to play it back on him. It's a piece of shit. This is not prime minister. You can't make criminal come trick you. No. Can't make criminal come trick you. This is stuff. People you have to get serious. Yeah? And when them do them try to draw down people with them, you know. Sir, man, I salute you, yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. Salute you. See the time I run, you know, I say too tight and so you know, say, I forget when if you go clabber them, I clabber in time. Yeah? But me I tell you, well, I carry more Manley, you know. Show them more Manley because Manley I try to carry more Michael Manley. Him too stink. You attack Manley and know me I go clabber you. Everything, a matter of fact. Here, these are fully loaded. This is fully loaded. Everything we have to watch you. Yes, I remember, you know, we are teach the people them because we don't do tabloid. None do the tabloid. None. Him a fix economy and place it on stable part when you look him fence alone, him wall alone, bigger than the Great Wall of China to the size of Jamaica. Him wall alone can take out 3/4 people out of poverty in Jamaica. Him wall alone. The amount him have, the amount him grab. Me there. Soon forward, man. Soon, at soon Titan time, yeah? Me out.
We in lump sum, we a beat it till the hammer burn. We now make them get in them and again. None of them boy that we none of them. We in lump sum, we a beat it till the hammer burn. We now make them get in them and again. None of them boy that we none of them. We alone some rise up the bomber day.
I'm not a Judas, them a backstabber. I'm my wife, and this straight beauty and glamour. No guy can walk to near me with no dagger. Me have the heart of Mandela, but the mind of a Zama in the mold. Like a bullman, we send us the jammer. Lyrically inclined, be a metaphor, so no listen to lyrics line to line. Become a lyrical fighter, put up in the rhythm, they want some more hole in a hater. Lyrically inclined.